April 30th, 1945. The day Adolf Hitler died. An admirer of the movie Snow White and a lover of animals, he is one of the most bloodthirsty personalities in history. A figure of totalitarianism, a symbol of propaganda as an anchor and source of power. His mustache and mastery of the masses made him a reverse of Chaplin. While one denounced the madness of war action, the other was responsible, no more no less, for starting World War II, and was the perverse mind behind the perpetration of an unprecedented genocide. He even collected Jewish objects that he intended to show to the public in a museum that he wanted to found, and which he would call Museum of an Extinct Race. Fortunately, his plans did not prosper. At 21:30 hours on May 1st of 1945, Hamburg radio reported that it would soon make a serious and important announcement to the German people, after which it began to broadcast solemn music by Richard Wagner, the favorite composer of the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler. At 22:20, a broadcaster coldly exclaimed that the Führer had fallen at his command post, fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism. Special emphasis was placed on highlighting that he had died like a hero. Immediately, the official information raised many doubts. It was already known at that time that lying was an essential part of the Nazi regime. In addition, there was plenty of evidence that Hitler had a large number of doubles. Was the news of his death part of the fraud? Or a last-ditch effort to save himself after the fall of his empire? Adolf Hitler was born in Braunau am Inn on April 20th, 1889. He was the third child of his parents, who were first cousins and Austrian customs officers. His childhood was marked by the abuse of his father and constant moving. As a child, he was a good student, but then, to rebel against his father, he lost interest in the classroom. From his early years, he began to show a fascination for painting and even faked an illness to get expelled from school at 16 and devote himself to art full-time, thus renouncing the family mandate. Adolf Hitler earned a living by painting pictures, shoveling snow, and working as a laborer in construction. He wanted to save money and stand out as a notable artist, but after 2 failed attempts to enter the Academy of Fine Arts, his goal would change. He would end up being famous. Yes, but not for his talent with the brush. In a recent interview, many people from different parts of the world were asked what they would do first if they had a time machine. Killing Hitler was the most chosen answer. Carrying a great frustration, Hitler began to read historical books and German mythology. This obsession with stories about the German people turned him into a fervent pan-German nationalist who abhorred the Habsburgs and ethnic diversity. In 1913, he fled the Austro-Hungarian Empire to avoid military service, taking refuge in Munich, where he joined the German ranks during World War I. There, as a result of gas poisoning, he was temporarily blinded. Upon regaining his vision, Hitler found himself in a great lost war, which led him to accuse politicians of betraying Germany by accepting the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. It was then that he decided to join a far-right party, where through passionate speeches he rose to become the top leader. The National Socialist German Workers' Party declared itself anti-Semitic, nationalist, anti-liberal, anti-communist, and anti-pacifist. Influenced by Mussolini, he tried to seize power in 1923, but ended up in jail for 9 months. Far from giving up, he used that time to write Mein Kampf, a book in which he outlined his political ideas and the patterns to follow to take the Aryan race to the top. To this day, this book continues to stir controversy. Once he left prison, Hitler revived the National Socialist Party by expelling all those who did not share his ideals or who could overshadow him. It was then when he surrounded himself with Göring, Goebbels, and Himmler. The joint work of his entourage brought thousands of discontented Germans to Hitler's side due to the crisis the country was in. Gradually they gained followers, until in 1933 he was appointed head of government by Hindenburg. Once in a position of power, he destroyed the constitutional regime and established a single-party dictatorship with him as the ultimate reference, marking the beginning of the Third Reich. It was a totalitarian regime with extreme nationalism, numerous flags, and grandiose settings. A regime that had much of its foundations based on racial superiority. After Hindenburg's death, Hitler proclaimed himself Führer of Germany, subjecting the army to an oath of loyalty. All those who did not follow him ended up dead or badly wounded on the night of the Long Knives in 1934. In addition, the Nuremberg laws were accepted, which were paving the way for Hitler's systematic extermination of the Jews, who were also used for unscrupulous experimentation of all kinds. Around this time, a Hitler who was increasingly obsessed with rehearsing his speeches began to establish strong ties with other European dictators. In 1939, Germany had a well-trained, indoctrinated, and armed professional army. Their goal, the domination of Europe and also the world. Convinced of his power, Hitler invaded Poland. There, he would encounter the armed opposition of France and Great Britain. World War II broke out, a war that would end the lives of over 60 million people according to some estimates. Others do not hesitate to speak of 100 million dead or perhaps more during the first 2 years of war. The German army defeated its opponents occupying Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Yugoslavia, and France. In addition, it had allies such as Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Spain, Italy, and Finland. Great Britain resisted as best it could the attempts of invasion and German bombings. It was then that Hitler decided to go for the Soviet Union, as it would give him immense territory and the gateway to Asia. But his decline began in 1941 when the United States entered the war. That's when the course of events began to turn for the hitherto overwhelming Nazi leader. After the American incursion would come the counterattack of the Red Army, the landing in Normandy, the advance of the Allies through France, and the liberation of Paris. Hitler was on the ropes. On April 24, 1945, Soviet troops reached the suburbs of Berlin. The Führer, seeing the tanks firing in the ruined streets, understood that his end had come. He lost power and allies until he found himself taking refuge in an underground bunker of the Chancellery. But what happened there? With the Soviet occupation in Berlin, different versions emerged about what happened with Hitler and the news of his death. On May 3, 1945, the Red Army reported that Hans Fritzsche, the number 2 of the Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, had said that he and Hitler had committed suicide in the Nazi leader's bunker. That same day, a radio station in Paris claimed to have received reports that the Führer had been murdered on the night of April 21st, after a dispute with his own generals. The Japanese news agency Demise reported that he had died during a Soviet artillery attack on his residence. A former high-ranking official of the Nazi Foreign Ministry believed that Hitler had died several days earlier due to a cerebral hemorrhage and had then been taken to the German capital. However, efforts to find the body failed time and time again. On May 4th, the Soviet press indicated that the Red Army had not managed to enter the German Chancellery where Hitler's offices were located because the place was on fire and its structures were on the verge of collapse. 2 days later, the Soviets claimed that they had found a large number of bodies in the Chancellery, but none matched Hitler or Goebbels. On May 8th, a Russian general announced the discovery in the ruins of Berlin of a shot body that was identified as Hitler by members of his own domestic service, although a driver doubted. According to him, the body they had found was one of the cooks who also served as Hitler's double. 2 weeks later, Soviet intelligence revealed that, according to the staff attending to Hitler, the man had been euthanized on May 1st by a doctor named Morel. Apparently, he was semi-paralyzed and in a lot of pain. In June 1945, Soviet authorities reported that Hitler's remains had not been found and that he was likely still alive. That same summer, reports began to circulate claiming that Hitler was in various parts of the world. One of the many versions that circulated about Hitler's fate claimed that he had fled in a submarine to Japan. In July 1945, American authorities intercepted a letter claiming that Hitler was living on a ranch in Argentina about 700 kilometers from Buenos Aires. The case reached the hands of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Chief Edgar J. Hoover, who ended up dismissing it. A decade later, a report from the head of the CIA office in Venezuela reported that a former SS soldier claimed to have met Hitler a month earlier in Colombia. The document stated that the office could not verify the information's accuracy. But then, what really happened to Hitler? On May 2nd, members of the Soviet counterintelligence corps, known as Death to Spies, sealed off the Chancellery Garden and the bunker where the Nazi leader had been installed since January when the Red Army was advancing on Poland towards Germany. The operation to search for the body was carried out under the utmost secrecy. In May, Death to Spies agents found the bodies of Hitler and his partner, Eva Braun, buried in a hole opened by a bomb in the Chancellery Garden. Their dogs were with them. The bodies had been doused with gasoline and were partially burned. Hitler's was hard to recognize, so once in the morgue they removed the jaw in an attempt to identify him from the dentition. This was done a few days later when the Soviets located Kate Hussermann, the Führer's dentist's assistant, who provided them with his medical history and the required data. They confirmed that it was indeed him. A report presented in November of 1945 by historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who during World War II served as a British intelligence officer and was in charge of investigating the Führer's death, maintained that he committed suicide around 1530 on April 30th of 1945 along with Eva Braun, whom he had married the day before. He took his own life by firing a gun into his mouth, while she is believed to have ingested a cyanide capsule. Given that the Soviets had confirmed the Nazi leader's death from the start, why did they continue to fuel the theory that he was alive for years? Historians say Stalin was very interested in Hitler's fate, but kept it secret once he found out. Stalin's strategy, evidently, was to associate the West with Nazism and to make it seem that the British or the Americans must be hiding him. We must not lose sight of the fact that the defeat of Nazism opened the doors to the beginning of the Cold War. Moscow had a great advantage in defending its version. They took and controlled Berlin exclusively from May to early July of 1945, when the occupation zones were established. In addition, they arrested and held captive for years several of the bunker survivors. In their effort to hide the truth, they secretly arrested Kate Hussermann, the dental assistant who helped them identify the body. After 6 years in isolation, she was convicted for voluntarily participating in the Führer's dental treatment. Hitler's remains were kept by the Smirsch unit that found them. They took them with them every time they moved. So Hitler had many graves. The Führer was buried in a forest on the outskirts of Berlin, then in a town of Rathenau, and finally in a base that the Soviets set up in 1946 in Magdeburg in central western Germany. It was not until 1968 when they were given to publicly disclose details of the files that Moscow had on Hitler, as well as his autopsy. About 3 decades later, in 2009, the then head of the Secret Police Archive reported that Hitler's remains were cremated in 1970 and his ashes thrown into the Biederitz River, all to prevent his grave from becoming a Nazi shrine. Moscow, however, preserved Hitler's jaw with his dentures and a fragment of his skull in the State Archive. Or so they thought. In 2009, it was discovered that the skull actually belonged to a woman, which reactivated the old conspiracy theories. Journalists Jean-Christophe Brissard and Lana Parshina, to whom Vladimir Putin's government gave partial and controlled access in 2016 to the state archives of the Russian Federation, as well as military and secret police files related to the case, pointed out that pieces of glass were found in Hitler's dentures, which would suggest that he took cyanide, and cast doubt on whether he shot himself. Parshina reported that the Nazi leader showed signs of suffering from Parkinson's during his last days, so she wondered how he could have shot himself with his right hand under those conditions. Brisa, for his part, highlighted that they did not find bullet remains in Hitler's mouth, although he believes it is possible that he asked someone he trusted to give him a coup de grace after taking the poison. The Russian authorities also possess numerous objects that they found in the bunker, among which the sofa where it is said that the Führer and Braun committed suicide stands out. In any case, the general and the experts agree that the corpse found by the Soviet forces is Hitler's, and that the version offered by the radio on that 1st of May in 1945 was lying about two central issues. The Nazi leader had not died that day, and more importantly, he had not done so in combat. By then, Hitler was retreating to avoid suffering the fate of Benito Mussolini, of whose execution he had been informed 2 days earlier. He least of all wanted to have to answer for his actions before the law. The man who had promised to build an empire that would last a millennium was leaving the race after surviving 42 assassination attempts and consolidating power for only 12 years. He had shaken the world, leaving Europe in ruins and a still throbbing wound. On the other hand, many suspect that all these versions hide the truth that the terrible dictator lived his last days unpunished in total freedom. One way or another, seeing how the far right is advancing in the modern world, we can say that dead or not, Hitler's legacy is still present at least until the time machine is invented. And that's it for today's video. I hope you found what I told you interesting. If you liked it, please leave your like below, subscribe if you haven't done so yet, turn on notifications, and I'll leave a couple of videos around me for you to follow and continue with this marathon on this channel. My name is Magnus Mephisto, and this was The Day That.